Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that the quiet between two people can be the most dangerous thing in a house. It is quieter than anger, quieter than the clatter of accusation. It is the kind of silence that holds secrets like animals hold up in a shed, nervous, ready to bite. Martin learns this again that night when Smitty slides across the mattress and the small apartment's single lamp feels like a lighthouse in a storm, too bright, too intimate to ignore. The mattress springs sigh under the weight of decisions. The city beyond their window hums, indifferent. Martin can taste the salt of his own fear when he leans in. He has rehearsed words that never make it past the first breath. Instead he finds himself listening to Smitty's slow, measured voice, counting syllables the way someone counts heartbeats. "I don't know if forgiveness is a thing you can do on impulse," Smitty says. "It isn't an action. It's not like pushing a button. You don't get to just decide and then be forgiven." Smitty's hand is warm on his cheek. The touch is an old map, the kind he memorized when they were young and everything still fit together. Martin remembers, with a clarity that almost hurts, the afternoon when they met at the laundromat, and he thought, briefly and selfishly, that he'd found an island to which he could return. That memory is both the mouthful of sugar that keeps him sweet and the rock that drowns him. It makes him want to confess and, at the same time, to run from asking for mercy. He has kept a secret so heavy it changes the weight of the world. Kenny is dead. Martin has not told Smitty the truth about how it happened. The truth is messy. It is a braided rope of decisions and small betrayals. Martin had traded information, names, places, the kind of small details criminals hoard like keepsakes in order to save his cousin from a kidnapper. He had done it because the cousin's screams are the kind of thing that rearrange your ribs, because blood is a line that draws you into action in a way silence never could. The exchange was ugly. He had sat on his stoop under sodium lights and given up a thread of his life in the hope of buying another's. The trade worked. The cousin came home, but the cost was different, and Martin still cannot say whether the ledger ever balanced. In the aftermath of that bargain, other things fell apart. Kenny's death among them, and Martin folded the loss into his pocket like a cracked coin. Embarrassed and ashamed, he told himself that some details were too blunt to carry across a bedroom. He told himself he couldn't risk losing Smitty over something that, in the calculus of survival, had been necessary. Smitty pulls him down into a kiss that is more question than answer. Lips meet like letters colliding on a page, and for a brittle moment Martin believes that forgiveness can be faked into being. He remembers the way panic had driven him to do the trade, a cold, efficient panicked logic that felt for a second like righteousness. If he had to choose between the life of a cousin and his own moral purity, the choice felt less like a choice than a mandate. He would give up the part of himself that was neat, that fit into books and the right corners of society, if it meant someone else would breathe. There is a tenderness in the way Smitty moves around him, a kind of generosity that is born of long acquaintance. She does not demand the full story then. She asks instead for presence, for the small architecture of being nearby. They make love with the awkwardness of two people who have been keeping secrets like children hide toys, half of them ashamed, half of them clinging to the act as proof that the world can still feel normal. It is an affair with time. They press into each other like two pieces of a broken clock trying to find the original tick. Martin's relief is immediate and animal, to be held, to be wanted, to be allowed back into the old muscles of affection. He kisses Smitty and tells her, "I don't ever want to lose you," and the promise feels both true and theatrical, the way vows always do when spoken under pressure. When the storm passes and the sheet slips from their bodies like a curtain, Smitty says what she has been thinking all along: sex is not a contract. "This doesn't mean we're back," she says, in the soft language that always carries its own clarity. The words are not a rebuke, they are an instruction manual. Martin feels a small, hot disappointment, like his hands have been closed around air. For a moment he had hoped the physicality of their reunion would be the bridge across every terrible gulf. But Smitty's refusal to let the act count for absolution is kinder than a lie. It is demand for the thing he has feared most: truth. Martin wants to apologize with the rhetoric of his old self, the self who can spin a sentence into daylight, but he is too raw for eloquence. He promises instead to tell everything, to place the knotted truth of Kenny's death and the bargaining for his cousin into the open like offerings on a table. Smitty listens the way someone listens when a storm's name is distant yet imminent. She nods and says, quietly, "Then tell me." The ask is simple. It is also impossible. Martin leaves the bed that night with a promise on his lip and a silence in his gut. He believes, foolishly, in the redemptive power of confession, that honesty will purify, will restore the world to its previous contours. But he has learned that confession is not always a cure. Sometimes it is an excavation that reveals more bones than you were ready to find. The memory of Kenny's last breaths is not cinematic. There is no dramatic montage, only the small, brutal logistics of death. He remembers the color of the hospital sheets, the way fluorescent light made everything mercilessly clear, the odd smell of alcohol and disinfectant. He remembers the way the doctor's face moved like a map of information he couldn't read, economy of words, an attempt at solace. There were decisions to be made: autopsy, police statements, who to call. Martin made choices. Some were instinctive, frantic, others were cold and considered. In all of them he thought he was doing the right thing, negotiating, bargaining, doing whatever it took to keep the rest of them safe. The problem is that rightness is not a balm for grief. It does not solve the fact of an empty chair, the way an absence reshapes the furniture of a family into a house of ghosts. Smitty understands enough of the outline to knows there were deals, that Martin was somewhere in the back rooms of the city, exchanging pieces of himself for other people's lives. She knows that he has been changed. The question for her is not only whether she can forgive, it is whether she has the energy to rebuild the architecture of a life that includes someone who has been at the edges of choices she cannot agree with. She is, in equal measure, tender and ferocious. "If you want me to stay," she tells him later, buttoning his shirt with slow, precise fingers, "then you have to be willing to let me decide whether that's enough." The domestic stakes are personal and broad. Martin's parents are getting a divorce, a fact he learns in the clipping silence of the morning after their reconciliation. It hits him not as a surprise but as a final kind of validation, proof that things can end without violence, in small, administrative ways. His father has been moving the furniture of his life as if peeling wallpaper. His mother's laugh, once a resource that stood day after day, has gone brittle. The divorce is a wound, but it is also a motivator. If families can dissolve quietly, if vows can be exchanged and then withdrawn, Martin feels a fresh panic that he might lose Smitty the way his parents lost each other through attrition, through the slow eviction of intimacy. That terror is the fuel behind the plea he makes to Smitty. His fear of abandonment becomes a kind of crude heroism. He will fight to keep what he has, he will confess, he will change, and the divorce, in his mind, becomes both an accusation and a call to action. But change is costly and not always immediate. The morning after their intimacy, Martin sits on the apartment's narrow balcony and stares at the city, a chessboard of roofs and skylines. He checks messages he cannot yet answer. He rehearses confessions to Smitty that sound like someone sweating out a performance. He tries to be brave but is small with anxiety. He is certain that if he could only unspool the whole thing, guide the sequence of events with the necessary context, Smitty would be able to choose whether to stay. He has also learned, in the raw, moral theater of the last months, that people often choose the safety of ignorance. Sometimes ignorance is chosen because the absence of knowledge is a ballast. He doesn't want Smitty to default to not knowing. He wants her to know and to choose. Elsewhere, the House of Love and Lies is doing other work. Derek is a different kind of gambler. While Martin and Smitty negotiate the hard topography of confession and truth, Derek treats affection like currency, making bets in the dark that he imagines are not wagers at all but investments. He is in a hospital room that smells of antiseptic and lemon, watching Ashley asleep under a sheet. Her face in sleep is softer than the one he checks in mirrors. He is intoxicated by the attention she gives him, the way she clutches his hand beside the hospital tray, the note of gratitude and dependence in her voice that he drinks like a tonic. Being needed is a kind of narcotic. He feeds on being at the center of someone's care. Derek's lies are never monstrous in themselves. They are porcelain shards of a mission that he glues into an image of himself he wants Ashley to love. He has told small fibs about his job, exaggerated his availability, softened the rough edges of his past. The lies are a net in which he hopes to catch the future. Tonight, in the slack pause between her waking and his exhaustion, he hears a sound at his feet, an almost absurd image, like a child's wind-up toy. It is the sensation of possibility. Perhaps a nurse has left a folded slip, perhaps a test that lives in coronary envelopes, a line of light showing a future. He feels the potential of it in his soles, a thrill that is at once animal and terrifying. But instead of telling Ashley the truth, fessing up to the entire dangerous, luminous longing, chooses to lie. He says things that make her smile, promises he cannot yet keep. Shanice finds out in the way many truths surface, not through confession but through a deliberate conversation that cuts like scissors. She meets Ashley in a cafe with chairs bolted to the floor and light that makes every face look like it is in a vignette. Shanice's tone is blunt because she has always been blunt, kind of person who speaks in whole sentences with the edges already sanded down. "Derek and I are friends," Shanice says, and there is a casualness to it that might be kind or cruel depending on who listens. "I'm relieved," an admission she hardly expected to carry. "You took him. You have him in a way that it makes it easier for me." Her relief is oddly generous. It is the relief of someone who has turned a page and is glad not to have to reread the same paragraph. Ashley listens with a face that is half victory, half grief. For her, Shanice's words are a kind of permission to love. She steps into the space with a tentative boldness, as if she has been given permission to mount the stage. Meanwhile, Derek, who overhears the conversation in a hallway later, feels the arithmetic of his lies beginning to tilt. Shanice's blessing is not immunity but a mirror. She is telling Ashley what she herself accepted, that letting someone you love go can feel like a penance that finally clears you. Derek's thrill curdles into the taste of coal. He has been holding a small, dangerous calculus, to keep Ashley's focus and affection, to be the man she believes him to be, while not dismantling the parts of himself that feel untethered. There is the potential for beauty in these small betrayals. Love is messy and raw, and sometimes people lie to protect themselves from their own bigness. Derek has not been brave, and the lie he carries nestles into his throat, making a scar tissue of the truth. But he's frightened that the real thing is too big, too crumbling at the edges. He tells himself that the lie will be temporary, that once the romance solidifies he will scoop up the truth and place it gently at Ashley's feet like an apology. But apologies, like many economic instruments, have interest. The longer a lie is owed, the higher the price. Back at the apartment, Martin tries to assemble the language of disclosure. He writes sentences in the Notes app, phrases that sound like law and like prayer. He wants to tell the truth about the bargaining that saved a cousin and the price that was extracted for it. He imagines Smitty's reaction in movements, first the small shock, then the outline of grief, then possibly an act of withdrawal that could reconfigure everything he holds dear. He rehearses the way to explain the multiplication of choices that led to Kenny's death, how culpability is not always singular, how sometimes goodness looks like violence in the wrong light. He tries to be generous toward himself and fails. There are fractures everywhere, families that dissolve like sugar, lovers who try to fix the unfixable with sheets and promises, friends who choose to speak and then wonder whether silence might have been kinder. The city outside is a litany of other people's evenings, and the sound of cars on wet pavement is oddly like the turning of pages. Martin stands with a glass of water and feels the silence gather. He knows that to be honest will be to invite consequences. But he also knows that to live in a house of constructed repairs is to lie to the person he wants most to keep. He makes a decision to speak. But before he can mold the words into a shape that could be heard without detonating, the phone rings. It is a number he's been dreading. The detective on the case file he has kept like a loose hope. The voice on the other end is compact and professional. "We've had a development," the detective says. The 3 words land like a door slamming. Martin feels as if someone has taken his knees. He knows what the phrase can mean in a world of investigations. Witness statements resurfaced, a new angle opened, someone who remembers the wrong thing. His pulse spikes. In his head, A sequence of futures arranges in less than a breath: confessions, warrants, the detail of a story becoming a public record. He glances toward the bedroom where Smitty sleeps, the lamp flickering like a cheap lighthouse. The idea of telling her with that phone call weighing on him is suddenly unbearable and inevitable at once. Across town, Derek hears Shanice's reassurance and feels a scorecard tip. He has been lying, and the ledger is beginning to demand settlement. He thinks of the warmth of Ashley's hand and the way she fell asleep against him in the hospital room. He wants to tell her about every fear he has, to give her the whole of himself in a way that is frightening and naked. But his courage has been taxed by years of small deceptions. He decides, instead, to keep the bright pieces of his life wrapped in paper. "I'll tell her tomorrow," he says to himself in the small hours, and the phrase becomes a promise that is not yet binding. The evening collects itself into pockets of urgency. Martin's plan to confess is interrupted by the detective's news. Smitty's demand for honesty becomes a pressure that is both necessary and cruel. Derek's chain of lies lies quiet but taut, ready to snap into consequences of a kind he has not yet imagined. Shanice's relief stung with the soft blur of dignity seems to close one door and open another. Each person's choice pushes the other's lives into new arrangements. The city watches, indifferent and curious, as people make decisions that will have moral consequences that outsize their intentions. No one knows, at the moment the phone call ends and the night goes heavier, what will break first: the confession that might save or doom, the lie that will ripple into a net he cannot control, or the small, tender promise of two people who refuse to be simple victims of circumstance. The future is a narrow corridor littered with old choices. Martin stands at the threshold. Smitty is breathing a faint map behind him. Derek walks home under a streetlight, consoled by a lie he promises to undo later. Shanice sips coffee, relieved and raw. The narrative has only begun to turn, and the next moves, legal, emotional, catastrophic or redeeming, are not yet dealt. The detective's voice did not leave Martin's ear even after the call ended. The phrase "we've had a development" echoed like a verdict before trial. He sat frozen in the dark, glass of water trembling in his hand, wondering if he had any time left to decide whether to tell Smitty the truth. Silence pressed against him until he heard her stir. Smitty's sleepy question, "Who was that?" was simple, but to Martin it felt like an interrogation. For the first time, he understood that keeping her in the dark was no longer an option. The story was going to surface whether he confessed or not. The next morning, sunlight broke through thin curtains, harsh and unkind. Martin told Smitty everything: Kenny's death, the bargain for his cousin's life, the lies he had stitched together to keep her close. Words tumbled like stones, some sharp, some dull, all heavy. Smitty listened, her face unreadable, but her hands shook against the coffee mug she held. When he finally stopped, the room felt emptied of oxygen. She asked only one question: "Did you ever think I couldn't handle the truth? Or did you just not want to see me leave?" Martin didn't answer. His silence was its own admission. Meanwhile, Derek's lie unraveled faster than he had imagined. Ashley found out not from him, but from a nurse who casually mentioned the progress in his legs. The betrayal stung harder than the lie itself. It wasn't just that Derek could feel his legs again, it was that he had chosen to withhold that joy, twisting it into a tool to keep her anchored to his bedside. Ashley's fury was quiet but surgical. She told him, with a clarity that felt like a sentence being passed, "You didn't want me. You wanted control." She left the room without looking back, leaving Derek to stare at his own reflection in the window, realizing that his lies had built him a prison with glass walls. Shanice, oddly, became the unlikely voice of perspective in Ashley's chaos. She admitted she had forgiven Derek long ago, but that forgiveness didn't mean Ashley had to. "Some people mistake needing someone for loving them," Shanice told her. "You don't have to keep carrying what he dropped." For Ashley, those words cracked something open. Pain and betrayal still lingered, but she began to see her anger not as a permanent scar, but as proof she deserved something better. Back at Martin and Smitty's apartment, the detective's update materialized into an unavoidable storm. Evidence tied Martin's information exchange directly to the violent fallout that led to Kenny's death. It wasn't just guilt in his mind anymore, it was legal, concrete, undeniable. When detectives arrived to question him formally, Martin felt the walls close in. Smitty stood by his side, but her body was tense, her loyalty cautious. She did not walk away, but she didn't hold his hand either. She needed time to decide what his truth meant for her future. Martin's parents' divorce papers were finalized the same week, a cruel coincidence that underscored how fragile every bond in his life had become. Sitting in a sterile waiting room after signing documents with his father, Martin realized he was watching the collapse of the family unit he once believed unbreakable. Yet instead of despair, the moment gave him an odd clarity. Everything could fall apart, and still, people survived. Maybe survival, not perfection, was the real currency of love. In the final turn of events, Martin chose to cooperate with the investigation fully, refusing to dodge responsibility anymore. His testimony painted a picture of desperation, of a man cornered into trading secrets for blood ties. The court would decide how much mercy he deserved, but for the first time in months, Martin stopped lying to the law, to Smitty, and most importantly, to himself. Smitty, after days of silence, came to see him before a hearing. Her words were neither a declaration of reunion nor a farewell. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted, her voice steady. "But I know I don't want a life built on lies. If we're going to rebuild, it has to be on ground that doesn't shift." Martin nodded, grateful even for uncertainty, because it was honest. Derek, on the other hand, spiraled into the loneliness he had tried to outrun. Without Ashley, without Shanice's presence, without the illusion of dependence, he was left with the raw ache of his own choices. In one of the closing images of his arc, he sat in the same hospital bed, legs twitching with new life, yet utterly motionless in spirit. The irony was brutal. The recovery he wanted most, the physical one, had arrived, but it exposed how little strength he had left to repair the damage he had done to his relationships. Ashley walked out of the hospital into a brighter day than she expected, Shanice at her side, both women understanding in different ways that healing was not about forgetting but about refusing to carry someone else's lie as if it were their own. Their futures were open, uncertain, but free of Derek's shadow. The story's ending wasn't about triumph or defeat but about the messy middle ground where truth and lies collide. Martin faced judgment but with a clarity that suggested redemption was still possible. Smitty weighed her love against the damage and realized forgiveness might be a process, not a single act. Derek sat in isolation, forced to confront the cost of manipulating the very love he craved. Ashley and Shanice, in their separate yet connected ways, stepped forward lighter, their paths no longer tied to deception. And perhaps that was the lesson buried under all the broken vows and desperate bargains. Love survives only when it is honest, and least whether told to protect or to possess always collect their debt.